Maria Williams was having one of those mornings when everything seemed to be running late. The sound of her alarm had been drowned out by the rain beating against her window, and by the time she rushed out of her apartment, the usual bustle of the city streets felt louder than ever. The clock on her dashboard ticked away relentlessly. As she navigated through the wet roads, her mind racing with thoughts of the presentation she was about to give at the art museum where she worked as a curator. Today was a big day. It was the opening of a new exhibit, one she had spent months putting together, and she could feel the pressure mounting with every passing minute. As she turned onto the main road, she could see the flashing lights of a police car behind her growing closer. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced at her rearview mirror and let out a frustrated sigh. Pulling over to the side of the road, she knew there wasn't much to be done. She had been speeding to make up for lost time, and she was well aware of the consequences. Officer Daniels stepped out of the patrol car, his uniform dark and formal. As he approached her vehicle, his eyes quickly scanned the scene. Before meeting hers, he asked for her license and registration. Without any pleasantries, Maria handed over the documents, her fingers feeling slightly clammy. She could tell he wasn't in the mood for small talk, and she certainly wasn't in the mood for an interrogation. After a brief moment of silence, Officer Daniels cleared his throat and asked if she knew why he had pulled her over. Maria glanced at the speedometer and then back at him. It was an obvious question, but she didn't want to give him any more reason to be difficult. Yes, she admitted, I was speeding on late for a meeting, she added in a soft voice, trying to offer some context of her situation. He didn't seem moved by her explanation. His face remained impassive as he wrote down the ticket, the pen moving steadily across the paper. He handed it to her without a word and gave her a look that suggested she should have known better. There was no sympathy, no acknowledgement of the circumstances, no sign of understanding. Thank you, she said quietly as she took the ticket, feeling a mix of embarrassment and frustration, well aware of the extra stress this would add to her already hectic day. Officer Daniels simply nodded before turning back to his car without another word. As she drove away, she couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of injustice. She had been polite, she had explained herself, and yet all she had received was a fine that would surely be more of a hassle than anything else. The ticket wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a reminder that in moments like these, people like her were easily dismissed and judged by their appearance rather than their story. The rain continued to fall as she made her way to the museum, the weight of the ticket in her glove compartment feeling heavier with each passing minute. She was sure she'd find a way to contest it, but at that moment, all she could think about was how unfair it felt, how little empathy had been shown to her, and how her day had just gotten a whole lot harder. The courtroom was nothing like Maria had expected. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as she walked through the tall doors, her heels clicking against the cold marble floors. The sterile smell of polished wood and paper hung in the air, the faint echo of voices from behind closed doors adding to the tension. She had been to the courthouse before, but never as a defendant. Today, she wasn't there for a meeting or a lecture. Today, she was there to fight a ticket. Maria adjusted her blazer as she made her way to the front, her mind racing. The case seemed so small, so trivial to the larger picture of her life, but the unfairness of it gnawed at her. How had it come to this? How had a simple traffic ticket become the focal point of her day? She took a seat, glancing around at the other people in the courtroom, the lawyers, the families, all of them waiting for their moment to speak, their voices to be heard. She couldn't help but wonder how many others in this room had been given a fair chance to defend themselves. At the front of the room, behind the raised desk, sat Judge William Harper. He was exactly what she had imagined when she heard his name. Tall, stern, with a serious expression that rarely softened. His robe hung loosely around his shoulders, and he gave off an air of authority that seemed to demand respect without effort. The moment he entered, the room became still, everyone standing up in unison as he took his seat. The gavel slammed, the sound echoing through the room, and the proceedings began. Maria tried to steady her nerves as the first cases were called, each one blending into the next. But when her name was finally called, everything seemed to stop. She stood up, adjusting her glasses and taking a deep breath before stepping forward. The judge's eyes briefly flicked up from his papers as she reached the stand, but his face remained unreadable, distant. Ms. Williams, you are here today to contest the fine issued for speeding. Is that correct?" Judge Harper's voice was firm, authoritative, and without a hint of emotion. His gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering, as though trying to read her every move. "Yes, Your Honor," Maria replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I admit I was speeding, but I had a valid reason. I was late for an important meeting at the museum. I wasn't trying to break the law or cause any harm." Judge Harper's expression didn't change. "Late for a meeting? I'm afraid that's not a sufficient reason to ignore the law, Ms. Williams. Traffic regulations are in place for everyone, no matter the circumstance." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She knew she wasn't going to get sympathy here, but she hadn't expected such a quick dismissal. "I understand, Your Honor, but I was in a rush due to factors beyond my control. I wasn't speeding recklessly. I was just trying to make up for lost time. I didn't intend to endanger anyone." The judge didn't seem to be moved by her words. He glanced at the ticket, then back at her, his brow furrowing. "I see. Nevertheless, your actions still violated the law. It's not about intent. It's about following the rules. The fine stands." Maria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She could sense that Judge Harper wasn't hearing her at all. Not really. To him, she was just another face, another case to deal with, nothing more. There was no empathy, no room for context. She didn't expect him to fully understand her situation, but she had hoped for something more than a cold, mechanical response. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I just want a fair chance to explain," Maria said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She had never been one to back down, not when it came to something she truly believed in. Judge Harper looked up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't appreciate the challenge in her voice, and for a moment, Maria thought he might scold her. But instead, he simply nodded, his decision made. "The fine stands," he said again, his voice final. "You may leave now." As Maria stepped away from the stand, she could feel the weight of the decision hanging over her. She had been polite, respectful, and clear in her explanation. And yet she had been dismissed with a simple ruling. No matter what her intentions had been, it didn't seem to matter. To Judge Harper, she was just another person who had broken the rules, nothing more. She left the courtroom, her head held high. But inside, she felt a mix of frustration and resignation. She had lost the case, but in a way, she knew this was far from over. The fine was one thing, but there was something deeper at play here. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about something more. Something that needed to be addressed, something bigger than just her. The news of Maria's court appearance spread quickly throughout the town, sparking conversations in coffee shops, at bus stops, and even among people who had barely known her before. Maria was a familiar face in the community, but most of her interactions had been polite, fleeting moments, greetings in passing or the occasional chat with neighbors. But now she was a subject of debate, the center of attention in a way she had never anticipated. Her friends and colleagues at the museum, especially those in the local art scene, were furious about the outcome. It wasn't just the fine, but the cold, dismissive way she had been treated in the courtroom. A woman like her, who's done so much for the community, being dismissed like that. Unbelievable, one of her colleagues, Alex, said during a meeting at the museum. She deserved more respect than that. Maria appreciated the support, but a part of her felt conflicted. She wasn't sure if she wanted to make a big fuss over a simple ticket, especially when there were far bigger issues in the world. But as the conversations continued to swirl around her, she realized that the incident wasn't just about her. It was about something much deeper. She had been given no chance to explain herself, no real consideration for her background or her role in the community. In that courtroom, she had been reduced to a statistic, just another person in front of a judge who was more concerned with enforcing the law than understanding the individual behind the infraction. At the local diner, where people gathered for coffee and news, discussions about the case reached a fever pitch. Some were supportive of Maria, acknowledging the frustrating reality that people like her, Black women in particular, were often treated unfairly by the justice system. Others, however, were quick to dismiss her frustrations. She was speeding, wasn't she? One man said, shaking his head. No reason to get all worked up about it. But Maria's supporters weren't backing down. Over the next few days, a social media post went viral, highlighting her case. People began sharing their own stories of unfair treatment in courtrooms, some of them dealing with similar issues, minor violations turning into significant injustices. The more people rallied behind Maria, the more the conversation grew. It became clear that this wasn't just about one traffic fine. It was about how the justice system often overlooked the stories and lives of those it was meant to serve. The pressure on Judge Harper also started to mount. There was no escaping the spotlight now. His decisions, his past cases, and his behavior in the courtroom were all being scrutinized. People in the community, especially those who had long felt marginalized, began to question whether someone with his mindset was truly capable of serving fairly. Had he ever taken the time to consider the context behind the cases he ruled on? Or was he simply going through the motions, assuming that everyone who stood before him was just another case to close? Meanwhile, Maria found herself caught between feeling grateful for the support and overwhelmed by the attention. She didn't want to be the face of a movement. She didn't want this ticket to become the symbol of something bigger. But as more people spoke out, she couldn't ignore the fact that her experience had struck a chord with many. The issue wasn't just the fine, it was about the system itself. And suddenly, it seemed like everyone around her was asking the same question. Why did it take something like this for people to start listening? Maria tried to focus on the bigger picture, keeping her eyes on the upcoming exhibit she had worked so hard to prepare. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The exhibit, which was set to open in just a few weeks, was supposed to highlight the work of Black artists and their role in history. Now she couldn't help but think about how much of the community would be coming to see her work with the recent controversy hanging over her. She wondered if people would judge her through the lens of the traffic fine and the media attention, or if they would finally see her for the person she was, the curator, the artist, the advocate for culture and history. As the days passed, Maria grew more determined. She wasn't going to let the story of the fine define her. She had a bigger role to play, one that went beyond courtroom battles and public opinion. But one thing had become crystal clear. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about giving everyone a chance to be heard, no matter their circumstances. And she was ready to make sure her voice, and the voices of those like her, would finally be given the attention they deserved. As the weeks passed, Maria found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. The support from her community had been overwhelming, but so had the scrutiny. It wasn't just her court case anymore. It had become something larger, a reflection of the way people often overlooked the lives and contributions of Black individuals in her town. The issue of racial inequality, of being judged based on appearance rather than context, was suddenly front and center in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. But through it all, Maria remained focused on the one thing that had always been her anchor: art. She threw herself into preparing for the upcoming exhibit, Voices Unheard, more determined than ever to make it a success. The exhibit would feature the works of Black artists, showcasing their contributions to culture, history, and identity. Maria had been curating exhibitions for years, but this one felt different. It was personal. She had chosen pieces that spoke to struggles she knew all too well, the pieces that reflected resilience, beauty, and the complexity of Black experience. Each work was a testament to the artist's journeys, and through them, she hoped to spark conversations that would transcend the walls of the museum. Yet, as the opening day approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that her own story was now intertwined with the exhibit in a way she hadn't anticipated. People would be looking at her, at the woman behind the artwork, wondering if she was more than just a curator. Would they see her as the artist, the creator, the one who had put everything together? Or would they simply view her as the woman who had been fined by the judge? Maria didn't know the answer, but she wasn't going to let it stop her. She had always believed in the power of art to change minds, to open hearts, to start conversations. And now she would need to believe in that more than ever. If her exhibit could shine a light on the unseen struggles of others, perhaps it could do the same for her. On the day of the exhibit's opening, the museum was buzzing with excitement. The walls, now adorned with the works of talented Black artists, seemed to hum with energy, as though the pieces themselves were alive with stories waiting to be told. People from all walks of life were walking through the doors: local residents, artists, collectors, and even the town's more influential figures. Maria stood near the entrance, greeting visitors, making small talk, but her mind was elsewhere. She had spent so much time organizing and curating the exhibit that she hadn't fully prepared herself for what the event would mean. It wasn't just about art anymore. It was about standing in the space she had created, surrounded by the very pieces that told stories she was all too familiar with. As the evening went on, something unexpected happened. Judge Harper walked through the door. Maria hadn't seen him arrive, but there he was, standing just a few feet away from her. He was scanning the walls, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes following the art with an intensity that seemed out of place for someone who had once dismissed her so easily. Their eyes met briefly, but neither spoke. Maria felt a mix of emotions: surprise, tension, curiosity, but she didn't say anything. She was a curator now, and she was going to let the art speak for itself. Judge Harper continued to walk through the exhibit, pausing in front of certain pieces, his expression unreadable. Maria watched him from the corner of her eye. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was seeing. Was he noticing the stories in these paintings, sculptures, and photographs? Was he starting to understand something about her, about the way she viewed the world? She felt a twinge of something inside her, hope, maybe, or even a sense of justice, as though the space they were standing in now had a power that was beyond the legal system, beyond a courtroom. It wasn't just about a fine. It was about recognition, about seeing people as more than just their mistakes or their circumstances. As the night wore on, Maria stayed busy greeting more guests, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if Judge Harper was starting to see her in a new light. Had he come here to apologize, or was he simply curious about the exhibit, about the art that had become a backdrop to their unfolding story? Before long, the crowd began to thin, and Maria found herself standing by the main gallery, alone for the moment. Then, unexpectedly, Judge Harper appeared beside her, standing silently for a few moments as he took in the pieces before him. The silence between them felt heavy, but also pregnant with unspoken understanding. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "This is incredible," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I didn't know the depth of your work, Ms. Williams. You've built something important here." Maria nodded, unsure how to respond. His words were unexpected, but they were a start. Maria stood still, trying to process Judge Harper's unexpected words. His statement wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the first real acknowledgement of her work that she'd received from him. She had assumed their interaction would be brief, perhaps even strained, but instead he lingered, his eyes scanning the artwork that she had painstakingly curated. It was clear that he was taking in more than just the beauty of the pieces. He was seeing their significance, the stories behind them, and perhaps for the first time, seeing her as more than just a defendant in his courtroom. "I'm glad you think so," Maria finally replied, her voice steady but guarded. She wasn't sure how to feel about his presence here, or the fact that he had shown up at all. Did he truly understand the importance of this exhibit, or was he just trying to redeem himself in her eyes? She had heard the whispers about his history in the town. His judgments often seemed swift, lacking the kind of personal insight that could humanize those who came before him. "I must admit, I wasn't aware of the full scope of your work before today," Judge Harper continued, his tone softer now, more reflective. "I've heard about your contributions to the community, but seeing it firsthand, it's different. It's powerful." Maria watched him carefully. She had spent years cultivating her reputation as a curator, as someone who was deeply invested in the local art scene. But this moment felt different. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of skepticism. Was this a real shift in his thinking, or was it just a formal attempt to save face after their courtroom encounter? Before she could respond, another voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, Ms. Williams," a woman said, approaching them with a clipboard in hand. It was one of the museum's staff members, likely there to assist with the event. She glanced between Maria and Judge Harper before speaking again. "We're about to start the artist talk in the next room, and we wanted to make sure you were ready to begin." Maria gave a quick nod. She had almost forgotten about the artist discussion she was scheduled to lead. It was meant to be a time to engage with the artists featured in the exhibit, to talk about their work, and to foster a deeper understanding of the themes presented. It had been part of her vision for the exhibit from the start, and now she realized it was the perfect opportunity to shift the conversation further, to address what had happened with the ticket and the larger issues of systemic injustice that she and so many others had faced. "I'll be right there," she told the staff member. She then turned back to Judge Harper. "I'll need to go in a few moments to start the artist talk, but I appreciate your comments about the exhibit. It means a lot to me, especially coming from someone like you." He nodded but didn't speak immediately. There was a moment of hesitation in his eyes as he took in the atmosphere of the exhibit, the energy in the room. He had always been a man of few words, but now, for some reason, Maria could sense that there was more he wanted to say. Instead of pressing him, she decided to move forward, hoping that perhaps their brief interaction had been a turning point, at least for her. As she made her way toward the artist talk, she couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. Judge Harper's presence was a twist she hadn't anticipated, but it made her realize something important. This exhibit wasn't just about showcasing art. It was about opening minds, about challenging preconceived notions, about inviting dialogue, even with those who might not have seen her, or people like her, in the light she wished to be seen. She entered the next room, where a small group had gathered to hear the artist speak about their work. The energy in the room shifted as she began to speak, her words flowing more easily than they had in weeks. The artists were passionate about their pieces, and Maria led the conversation, guiding them through the stories behind their creations. The discussions ranged from the struggles of Black identity to the impact of art as resistance, and she'd found herself sharing her own thoughts as well, albeit carefully. She didn't want the focus to shift away from the art itself, but she couldn't deny that the discussion was a personal one for her too. As the talk continued, Maria could feel a sense of satisfaction, of peace. This was where she truly belonged, surrounded by artists, by those who understood the power of creation, of representation, and of speaking truth through art. It wasn't just about the controversies surrounding her find. It was about giving people a space to be heard, to be understood, and to be recognized for their worth. By the time the evening was over, Judge Harper had long since left, but the sense of something having shifted lingered. Maybe it was too early to tell whether his views had truly changed, but Maria realized that her role in the community wasn't just as a curator or an advocate for art. It was as someone who had a responsibility to challenge the status quo, to create spaces where people could see one another more clearly, and perhaps, just maybe, to open a few eyes along the way. The weeks following the opening of Voices Unheard were a blur of activity for Maria. The exhibit had been a resounding success, drawing crowds from across the town and even from neighboring cities. The conversation around the show and her own experience with the court case had taken on a life of its own. It wasn't just about art anymore, it was about identity, systemic inequalities, and the power of using one's voice to challenge the norms. The day after the artist talk, the museum's phone had been flooded with calls, many from journalists wanting to cover the exhibit's impact, some asking specifically about Maria's story. The local news outlet had even run a segment highlighting her work and the role of Black artists in shaping the cultural landscape of the community. Maria found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. She had never wanted to be in the spotlight like this, not for something as personal as a traffic ticket. But now, with the public's eye fixed on her, she realized that this attention could be leveraged for something greater. At the same time, Maria couldn't help but feel conflicted. She had always been someone who worked behind the scenes, advocating for artists, curating exhibitions, and creating spaces for others to shine. But now the story was about her, and she didn't know if she was ready for this kind of scrutiny. Every conversation, every interaction, felt charged with an energy she hadn't anticipated. People were watching, waiting for her to speak up, to take a stand. One evening, as she was sitting in her office at the museum, a message popped up on her phone. It was from Alex, a colleague and close friend who had been particularly vocal about the injustice of her find. "We need to talk. You've got an opportunity here. Don't let it slip, *." Maria stared at the message for a long moment, unsure how to respond. She knew Alex was right. There was an opportunity here, a chance to speak out against the unfairness that had marked her encounter with the justice system. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how many others had probably faced similar challenges, only to be silenced by fear, lack of resources, or simply the overwhelming nature of the system. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about giving voice to those who had been overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. But what would speaking out accomplish? Would it be enough to change people's minds, or would it just invite more criticism? Maria didn't have the answers, but she knew that she couldn't stay silent. She had spent her career elevating voices, telling stories that needed to be heard. Now her own story had become part of the larger narrative. After a long night of contemplation, Maria decided to take action. The next morning, she called a press conference. It was a bold move, one that would bring even more attention to her story, but she felt it was time to confront the issue head-on. The conference was held in the same gallery where her exhibit had been displayed. The room was filled with journalists, photographers, and local community leaders, all eager to hear what she had to say. Maria stood at the front, her nerves on edge, but she knew this was the right decision. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice steady but firm. "I called this press conference not just to speak about the events surrounding my traffic ticket, but to address something much bigger. I want to talk about the way we, as a society, treat individuals, particularly Black people, when they are caught in a system." She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "We've all heard about the injustices that exist in our justice system, but I can tell you that it is more than just a headline. It's real, it's personal, and it impacts our lives in ways we often don't see. My experience in that courtroom wasn't just about a ticket. It was about the way the system failed to see me for who I am, for what I contribute to this community." Maria's words resonated through the room, and for the first time, she felt like her voice was being heard. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the weight of her message. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever felt unseen or dismissed. "Today, I stand here not just as a curator, but as someone who understands the power of art, of culture, and of community," she continued. "Art has the ability to speak to the truth of our experiences, and it is my hope that this exhibit, this space, serves as a reminder that we all have a story to tell. But we can only tell those stories if we are given the opportunity to be heard." The room remained still as her words lingered in the air. For a brief moment, Maria felt the full weight of her message, the responsibility, the power, and the opportunity that lay in front of her. She had started this journey as a curator, but now she was becoming something more, a voice for those who had been silenced. When the conference ended, the room buzzed with energy, but Maria felt a quiet calm inside. She had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to the community, the media, and everyone who had a stake in changing the conversation. She didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was on the path she was always meant to walk. The press conference had been a turning point for Maria. One that started as a simple statement of frustration had now turned into a movement. The press, hungry for a story, had taken her words and spun them into something much bigger than she had ever anticipated. The story wasn't just about a Black woman unfairly fined by a judge. It was about an entire community grappling with inequality, with the biases embedded within their systems. It was about justice, identity, and the power of speaking out. Maria had tapped into something larger, and the town couldn't ignore it. In the days that followed, Maria found herself both energized and overwhelmed by the attention. News outlets from across the state picked up the story, many even sending reporters to her exhibit to cover the aftermath of her statement. People who had never before paid attention to her work now recognized her as a symbol of resilience and truth. It was flattering, and yet, in some moments, it was exhausting. But she couldn't turn back now. The momentum had built, and people were listening. The day after the press conference, Maria received a call from an advocacy group focused on criminal justice reform. They wanted to partner with her to bring awareness to the systemic inequalities that had led to her experience in the courtroom. They offered to help her organize a community forum, a space where people could share their stories and find support in the fight for justice. For the first time in her life, Maria was being invited to lead a conversation she had always believed in, but never thought she would have the platform to initiate. With the support of the group, Maria began organizing the forum. She reached out to local leaders, activists, and members of the community who had long been fighting for racial justice. She also invited Judge Harper, hoping that he would come to see the impact of his actions, not only on her, but on the people he served. She had no idea whether he would attend, but she felt that it was an important step in holding him accountable, not just for the fine, but for his role in perpetuating a system that often failed to see the humanity in those it judged. In the weeks leading up to the forum, Maria poured herself into the planning. She carefully selected speakers who could share personal experiences with the justice system, those whose stories would highlight the patterns of discrimination that too often went unchallenged. She wanted the event to be more than just a conversation. She wanted it to be a catalyst for change. The day of the forum arrived, and the turnout was overwhelming. The museum's main gallery was packed with people, their faces a mix of hope, frustration, and determination. Maria stood at the front, ready to moderate the discussion. She looked out over the crowd and saw familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and even some former colleagues. But she also saw people she didn't recognize, people from all walks of life, drawn together by a shared desire to make a difference. As the forum began, the conversations were raw, emotional, and powerful. One by one, individuals shared their stories, stories of being treated unfairly, of being dehumanized by the justice system, of feeling invisible in a world that seemed to turn its back on them. Maria listened intently, her heart heavy but also filled with a sense of purpose. This was why she had started down this path. This was what art and culture were truly about, creating spaces where the unheard could speak and the unseen could be recognized. When it was her turn to speak, Maria stood up, feeling the weight of the moment. She could see Judge Harper in the back of the room, his expression unreadable, but she knew that this forum, this space, was the perfect opportunity to address the larger issue at hand. She began by acknowledging the community's pain, and then, as she had at the press conference, she spoke about her own experience. "I'm here not because of the fine I received," Maria said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm here because of what that fine represents. It represents a system that too often ignores the humanity of people like me. It represents the assumptions made about people based on their race, their background, and their circumstances." She paused for a moment, making sure her words resonated with the room. But it also represents an opportunity for all of us to come together and create change. This isn't just my story, it's our story. We all have a role to play in dismantling the system that divides us. As she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Maria felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. This was why she had fought so hard, why she had put herself out there. This was the moment when the conversation had shifted. This wasn't about a single fine anymore. It was about something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. After the forum, Judge Harper approached her, his face more open than it had been the last time they'd met. He didn't apologize, but there was something in his eyes that said he understood. The words he spoke next were simple, but for Maria, they meant everything. "I wasn't fully aware of the impact of my decisions, Ms. Williams," he said quietly. "But after hearing these stories, I can't unsee it." For Maria, it was a small step, but it was a step toward understanding, toward justice, and toward a future where the system might one day treat people like her with the respect they deserved. The forum had been a turning point for Maria, but she knew that the hard work was far from over. The conversation had sparked a fire, but now it was time to sustain the momentum and make sure that the changes they all hoped for were not just words but actions. As the weeks passed, Maria found herself balancing her duties as a curator with a newfound role as an advocate for racial justice. She continued to oversee exhibitions at the museum, but now every event seemed to carry a greater weight. She was no longer just creating spaces for art. She was creating spaces for change. Maria began to receive invitations to speak at other forums, panel discussions, and even local schools. She was now viewed as a leader in the movement for justice in her town, and while she had never sought such attention, she accepted these invitations with a sense of responsibility. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was representing the countless others whose voices have been silenced, whose struggles have been overlooked. Everywhere she went, she carried the stories of those who had shared their pain with her, and with every speech, she felt the burden of their experiences. Judge Harper, too, seemed to have undergone a transformation. He had attended the forum, and although he hadn't said much, his presence had been significant. Over time, Maria noticed subtle shifts in his actions. He began attending more community events, listening more carefully, and even engaging with local activists. One afternoon, a few weeks after the forum, he called Maria to ask if they could meet. His voice was serious but respectful. "I've been reflecting on everything we've discussed, Ms. Williams," he said, "and I realize that I need to do more. I want to work alongside you and others in the community to make real change. I can't undo what's been done, but I can try to be part of something better moving forward." Maria was stunned by his words. She had never expected an apology from him, let alone an offer to collaborate. But something in his tone felt genuine, and after everything that had happened, she understood that change could come from unexpected places. She agreed to meet with him, but she knew that real change would require more than just good intentions. It would require action, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Their meeting was a quiet one, held at the same museum where Maria had hosted the forum. They sat across from each other, surrounded by the artwork that had started it all. The conversation was slow at first, tentative, but as it went on, the two began to find common ground. Judge Harper spoke candidly about the flaws in the system, about the biases he had unwittingly perpetuated in his decisions. Maria listened, weighing each word carefully. She didn't know if this would lead to lasting change, but she believed it was worth trying. "I don't have all the answers," Judge Harper said, his voice low. "But I want to listen, I want to learn, and I want to help create a system that truly serves everyone." Maria felt a sense of cautious hope. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and she knew that change would take time, but this was a start, and sometimes that's all you need: a willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow. As time passed, Maria continued to be a bridge between the community and the justice system. She worked with local leaders to organize workshops on racial equity, restorative justice, and the importance of diversity in decision-making. The museum became a hub for these discussions, where people could come together to share their experiences, learn from one another, and push for real change. Judge Harper, though still a figure of authority, became an ally in this journey. He attended the workshops, listened to the community, and even began to advocate for reforms within the judicial system. His evolution wasn't instantaneous, but it was steady and sincere. Maria's exhibit, *Voices Unheard*, remained on display for several months, continuing to spark conversation about the role of art in social change. But now it had taken on an even deeper significance. It was no longer just an exhibition of art. It was a living, breathing reminder of the work still left to be done. And Maria had become a symbol of that work, showing that while the system may be slow to change, change was possible when people came together, when they spoke their truths, and when they were willing to face the uncomfortable realities of the world they lived in. The fine, the judge, and the courtroom drama were all distant memories now. What mattered was the work that had followed, the conversations that had been started, the lives that had been changed, and the understanding that had begun to grow. Maria had found her voice, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs. The community was stronger for it, and for the first time in a long while, Maria felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long, but it had led her to a place where she knew that the power of art, of storytelling, and of shared experiences could create real, lasting change.